Mariupol, formerly one of the largest settlements in southern Ukraine, stretching across 94 square miles and a home to over 400,000 people. Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mariupol was both a major hub for trade and manufacturing for Ukrainian businesses, whilst also hosting a picturesque seaside resort for holidaymakers. In 2022, however, disaster would strike. What was once a vibrant city, packed with culture and history, now lies in ruins. So how exactly did this happen? Mariupol was one of the very first locations attacked by Russian forces when the invasion began, on the 24th of February 2022. The once placid coastal city all of a sudden became the stage for a brutal siege that lasted until the 20th of May. Throughout the course of this battle, thousands of people would lose their lives, and many of Mariupol's buildings, showcasing hundreds of years of historical architecture, would be leveled completely. The siege of Mariupol would go down in history as one of Ukraine's fiercest defensive efforts during the entirety of the Russo Ukrainian War, which of course is still being waged at the time of this video. So how did this conflict play out? What happened when thousands of Russian troops encircled one of Ukraine's most important industrial cities? And what became of Mariupol after the siege was finished? In today's video, we'll be diving into the key events of the siege of Mariupol to answer all of these questions and more. Welcome to Wars of the World. While Mariupol is not amongst the very largest of Ukraine's cities, the settlement's access to a wide variety of industries and its position on the coast made it an attractive target for Vladimir Putin's forces when they first invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. The city was, at the time of the invasion, home to the Azovstal Iron and Steel Works, one of the largest steel companies in the country. If Russia were able to successfully capture Mariupol, they could bolster their own resource pool and severely impede Ukraine's. Mariupol, thanks to its trade ports to the south, was instrumental to the success of Ukraine's economy, and a Russian takeover would be disastrous. In addition to this, an unobstructed land route to Crimea would have been opened up, and Russian forces would have been able to seize full control of marine traffic in the Black Sea, along the southern coastline of the country. In reality, the 2022 siege was not the first time that Russia had been involved with Mariupol. Separatist militias from the Donetsk People's Republic, an annexed region of Ukraine backed by Russia, took control of the city following a series of pro-Russian protests in 2014. Just 1 month later, Ukrainian forces were able to recapture Mariupol, while troops from the Donetsk People's Republic moved into the neighboring village of Novoazovsk. Even so, the struggle was far from over, and the Republic moved in once more in late 2014, attempting yet another violent takeover. But Ukraine succeeded in defending the settlement. Following these battles, the Donetsk People's Republic began barraging Mariupol's buildings with rockets, which prompted the Ukrainians to launch a surprise attack on the separatist-controlled village of Shirokini. 4 months after this offensive began, the Republic withdrew from the village, and for a few years, Mariupol was conflict-free. The Donetsk-Ukrainian tensions around Mariupol were ended with the Minsk II agreement, but the Russian Federal Security Service's Coast Guard stirred the pot once more in 2018. In November, the waters just south of the city played host to the Kerch Strait incident, where the Russian Coast Guard fired upon and captured 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels. The Ukrainians were on their way to Mariupol's port when the attack took place, which caused Ukraine to briefly declare martial law. While a large-scale conflict did not break out, tensions were greatly threatened. As of the very beginning of 2022, just before the invasion and the subsequent siege commenced, Mariupol was defended by the Ukrainian ground forces, the National Guard of Ukraine, the Territorial Defense Force of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Naval Infantry. The historical tensions presented by the city's strategic position and the close proximity of the settlement to the Russian border meant that Ukraine had defended their position well. They were as well equipped for an attack on the city as they could possibly be, when the Russians ultimately came knocking in February of 2022. The day that Russia commenced their invasion of Ukraine saw the artillery shelling of the outskirts of Mariupol. Being such a strategic position for either side to hold amidst the ensuing war, Russia targeted the city early on. Fortunately, nobody was killed in these early bombardments, but 26 individuals were reportedly injured from the blasts. When Russian forces arrived at the limits of the city one day later, they came from territories to the east, controlled by the Donetsk People's Republic. As ground troops marched in, they were met with initial resistance from defenders stationed in the neighbouring village of Pavlopil. According to Ukrainian sources, over 20 Russian tanks were taken out in this very early exchange of fire. The troops of Pavlopil had bought the Ukrainians in Mariupol a little time to prepare for the ensuing siege. While ground forces marched on Mariupol to the east, Russia's Black Sea Fleet approached the city's ports from the waters to the south. Russian ships began to bombard coastal lands to the west of Mariupol, while Marines of the Naval Infantry stormed the beaches to approach the city from the opposite side. Over the course of the next few days, the Russians continued to bombard the city with artillery fire, leading to the deaths of several civilians. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians stationed in Mariupol began to attempt to repel the invaders at the settlement's borders. By the 28th of February 2022, Russian forces had completely surrounded Mariupol, and the siege had officially been set in motion. On the evening of the 28th, the Russians successfully managed to cut off the majority of Mariupol's internet, as well as electricity and gas, leaving the city in the dark, and mostly blind to any news from the outside world. Panic began to spread amongst the thousands of citizens trapped within the confines of the encircled city, as the Ukrainian military fiercely began to defend their position, and civilians inside attempted to flee. One report emerging from this stage in the battle suggested that a Ukrainian sniper had taken out Russian Major General Andrei Sukhovetsky of the airborne forces. While Sukhovetsky would be killed on the 28th of February, it is more likely that this happened near Kiev, or Hostomel, as his 41st Combined Arms Army attempted to advance deeper into the country. By the 2nd of March, there was no chance of escape from the city of Mariupol. Those trapped inside were actively blocked from leaving by Russian forces on the outskirts, and a reported water outage began to raise concerns. Russian shelling would commence once more, and as artillery fire rained down on the neighbourhoods of Mariupol, hundreds of civilians would lose their lives. By the 4th of March, the mayor of Mariupol, Vadim Boychenko, announced that his city was running dangerously low on water and medical supplies, following the shelling of Ukrainian hospitals, and he desperately called for the evacuation of his citizens, along with additional military support. The following day, on the 5th of March, a temporary ceasefire was proposed to be mediated by the International Committee of the Red Cross to help 200,000 of Mariupol civilians escape the chaos. A break in the fighting was announced to be carried out between 11 AM and 4 PM to allow the refugees to leave, and a humanitarian corridor was established to the southeast Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. At 11 AM, distraught and panicked civilians made their way to the entrance of the corridor, but they were forced to turn back as Russian artillery fire began to rain down once more. Reportedly, of the desired 200,000 refugees, only 17 of them managed to make it out of Mariupol that day. The following day, an attempted second evacuation was met with the same disastrous results, and the Red Cross began to report on the severity of the situation for refugees trapped in Mariupol. Over 700,000 civilians have been left without heat in the freezing Ukrainian winter, and many people were beginning to run out of water. By the 9th of March, enough Ukrainians were losing their lives in the shelling that city workers began digging mass graves in order to accommodate the fallen. Those who had avoided the shellings were now resorting to melting the thick snow outside their homes in an attempt to obtain water, as the heavy fire continued. On the outskirts of the city, Ukrainian soldiers fought with everything they had as the Russians tightened their clutch on Mariupol, but the siege was only just beginning. Throughout mid-March, Russian forces began to advance closer into the city, tightening their hold on Mariupol and applying immense amounts of pressure to the Ukrainians trapped within. This application of pressure was key to the success of their siege. They aimed to slowly deprive the Ukrainians of vital resources, cutting off heat and access to water throughout the remainder of the city. If the defenders had limited access to power in the cold Ukrainian coastlands, they would be more inefficient fighters. But despite the Russian advance, the Ukrainians continued to fight with their all. Utilizing artillery fire, they managed to take out multiple Russian tanks and armored vehicles as they pressed closer towards the center of Mariupol, and the evacuation for civilians, mainly Greek and Turkish foreign nationals, were orchestrated with the help of humanitarian aid workers. This humanitarian aid was vital to saving the lives of as many Mariupol citizens as possible. By the 14th of March, it was reported that over 450 tons worth of aid packages had been brought into the city, and over 160 vehicles filled with escaping civilians were able to leave the outskirts. The following day, a comparatively big success was achieved for the people of Mariupol. 20,000 civilians were able to leave the city, as 4,000 vehicles took them to safer locations outside the city limits. As the Russians advanced, the Ukrainians defending the outskirts of the city managed to end the lives of several high-profile Russian targets. Captain Alexei Glushak of the Russian GRU was killed soon after the Russians began to advance, while Major General Oleg Mityayev, who had been commanding the 150th Motorized Rifle Division, was shot as his men reached the outskirts. The invaders retaliated harshly, using airstrikes to target Mariupol's buildings, specifically those used for shelter by displaced civilians. A strike on the 16th of March on the Donetsk Regional Drama Theatre killed hundreds of sheltering refugees, and soldiers who were joining the Russians from the Donetsk People's Republic managed to seize the Mariupol airport 2 days later. By the 20th of March, Russia submitted an official request for the Ukrainians to surrender, and they expected a response by 2 AM the following day. But their offer was quickly rejected. The fighting continued without a pause, and the Ukrainians gained air support as part of Operation Air Corridor. This operation saw the arrival of Mi-8 helicopters to the Azovstal steel plant, where many soldiers had gathered to defend the city. These helicopters brought Stinger and Javelin missiles with them, as well as a replacement internet system for the military within the city. This operation also allowed just under 90 Ukrainian soldiers who had been wounded in the fighting to escape the city, but the initial helicopters were eventually shot down by Russian forces. Reportedly, 90% of helicopters that were sent to provide supplies and to evacuate the wounded from Mariupol were obliterated by both tank and artillery fire. Still, however, the evacuation attempts continued, despite the surmounting risk. Russian ground forces were able to breach the city on the 24th of March, just after Mayor Boychenko had been evacuated by the orders of special services. The Russians started by capturing ground around the Orthodox Church of the Intercession of the Mother of God, where soldiers would station themselves before continuing the offensive. Once they were inside the city, Russian forces began spreading false rumors to the civilians of Mariupol, claiming that Odessa, a major Ukrainian port city, had been captured, in an attempt to demoralize the populace. When the Russian military managed to advance into the center of Mariupol, the situation was looking dire for the Ukrainian soldiers who were defending their homeland. Boychenko, reporting from outside the city limits, called for a complete evacuation, and by the 28th of March had confirmed that Mariupol was, quote, in the hands of the occupiers. He also stated that around 5,000 people had been killed during the siege, and claimed that between 20 and 30,000 Mariupol residents had been rounded up and then sent to camps within Russian territory. Once the Russians had firmly moved into the city center, it did not take them long to seize a series of major buildings. They started with the governmental administrative building within the Kalmiuski district, before capturing major military headquarters within the city. In the first few days of April, they also managed to claim the Security Service of Ukraine building in the middle of Mariupol, and fighting in the immediate center began to cease. The Russians had now divided the Ukrainians into 3 separate pockets, one towards the north at Mariupol's Ilich steel plant, one to the south by the ports, and another trapped in the Azovstal steel plant to the southeast. The Ilich group attempted to hide from the Russians as they advanced into the city, but they were spotted, and once they began drawing heavy fire, they attempted to escape to a new location. They were scattered by the chaos, but some managed to group up with those fighting at the Azovstal steel plant. Azovstal had been encircled by Russian troops not long before, and the Ilich plant was taken by the 13th of April. Later that day, Russia managed to successfully capture Mariupol's commercial seaports, and a comparatively small number of Ukrainian fighters were left in the city, along with civilians who were unable to make it out when the evacuation attempts took place. By the time the Russians had entered the city center, the Ukrainian soldiers were exhausted and hungry. The entire city was lacking resources necessary to survive, even in the most basic of conditions, let alone in times of war. Reports soon began to emerge of the ill treatment of civilians at the hands of Russian forces when they entered the city. Hospitals, residential areas, and places of refuge were each bombed by Russian artillery fire, killing hundreds of innocent bystanders, while Russian forces on the ground were accused of looting homes, attacking civilians, and blocking access to humanitarian aid. Another unconfirmed accusation reported that Russian forces had been using chemical weapons of unknown origin in order to target Ukrainian forces during the siege, causing respiratory problems for those fighting inside the city. By the 15th of April, the largest pocket of Ukrainian fighters who had not surrendered, been killed, or been evacuated from Mariupol were holed up in the Azovstal steel plant. This massive Soviet-era metallurgic complex was a strategically defensive position. If you were going to be trapped anywhere in the city while defending from invaders, this was amongst the best places to be. Its workshops were resistant to airstrikes, and the complex layout of the plant provided many hiding places if the Russians were able to breach its center. While the Ukrainians trapped inside were calling for reinforcements, the Russians began to start their advance. Before arriving at the gates of the Azovstal steel plant, the Russians made their way around Mariupol, sweeping through any last pockets of resistance left within the city. They managed to secure the city's National Guard base, as well as several key strategic ports along the coastal stretch of the city. As they advanced closer to the plant, the Ukrainians made one last attempt at an evacuation. Around 500 soldiers that were still fighting at the ports were brought into the steel plant, while those stationed at Azovstal provided covering fire. Now Russia had cleared almost all of the city and claimed that the only Ukrainian military forces left within the city were those holed up at Azovstal. These last few hundred soldiers declined yet another Russian offer to surrender, and amidst threats of death and destruction, they continued to fight. Once the Russians had encircled the Azovstal steel plant, they received a direct order from Vladimir Putin to avoid storming it. Instead, they were instructed to wait out the Ukrainians who were trapped within, forcing them to run out of any remaining supplies. Before the siege began, hundreds of civilians had also made their way inside of the plant, and they were now trapped with the remaining soldiers. Ukrainian officials interpreted this as the Russians admitting that they were unable to take the plant by force, while international experts who were spectating the conflict commented that an attempt to invade the plant would be disastrous for both sides. The Russians soon began closing in some cases within just 20 meters of the plant, in order to begin the blockade, but very little fighting took place when they did. The airstrikes resumed on the 23rd of April, with Russian forces throwing as much firepower as they could towards their formidable adversaries. But despite the chaotic conditions, the soldiers inside pressed on, and they even managed to receive a package of supplies delivered from a helicopter approaching the plant under the cover of darkness that evening. However, these refreshed supplies would not last the Ukrainian soldiers long, and within just a few days they were lacking food and water once more. On top of this, their situation worsened when Russian airstrikes intensified to an as of yet unseen level of force, with supersonic tactical bombers raining hell from above. The Ukrainians trapped within the plant desperately tried to defend their position, but the clock was ticking, with the Russians sending an unimaginable degree of firepower towards them. By the end of April, it was stated by the Parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, that conditions for civilians trapped in the city had reached, quote, medieval levels, and due to the disillusion of healthcare systems and clean drinking water, these people were at an extreme risk of disease. The Mariupol City Council soon warned of deadly epidemics that could emerge from Mariupol if their citizens were not evacuated, and concerns were soon emerging that a possible cholera outbreak had taken place due to reduced living conditions within the city. Efforts were soon made to evacuate the remaining civilians from the Azovstal steel plant, coordinated by the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Another humanitarian corridor was set up to ensure the safe departure of the displaced citizens of Mariupol who were attempting to leave their ruined city. The first few evacuees would trickle out of the plant complex on the 13th of April. But this did little to put a dent into the estimated 1,000 or so still left inside the plant, and talks were soon underway to proceed with larger scale evacuations. However, fears arose that if a large-scale evacuation was attempted, that the Russian military would ignore any agreed ceasefire and continue to send forth airstrikes as the civilians attempted to make their way out of the city limits. Soon the siege had entered its final month, and an estimated 100 civilians were taken safely out of the steel mill via the humanitarian corridor established by the aid workers. By the 2nd of May, it seemed as though, to the Ukrainians' surprise, Russian forces were beginning to withdraw. From the Russians' point of view, they seemed to have their opponents exactly where they wanted them, using airstrikes alone. Many of the tanks and ground soldiers left Mariupol at this stage, in order to join the invasion elsewhere in Ukraine, but enough were left behind in order to make escape from Azovstal impossible. By the 3rd of May, the Russians that remained began to storm the plant. The siege was officially over, and the Ukrainians' last stand had just begun. It wasn't easy for Russian forces to storm the steel plant, even with many of the Ukrainians inside suffering from fatigue, thirst, and hunger. The defenders put up a fierce fight as the Russians attempted to break into the interior of the plant, and the ensuing battles were particularly bloody. Ukrainian soldiers made for the networks of tunnels underneath Azovstal, but their attackers were tipped off to their whereabouts. On the 5th of May, Russian forces began storming these tunnels in what would give way to tricky and intense close-quarters gunfights. Reportedly, a Ukrainian electrician had provided the Russians with information on the tunnels, but the accuracy of these claims cannot be verified. Later that day, Russian forces began detonating thermobaric vacuum bombs around the plant site. These explosives work by sending forth a fiery cloud of gas, creating a blast that reacts with the oxygen in the atmosphere. Ukrainians fighting in the tunnels would have been faced with severe burns and blasts from these attacks, but still they held their ground until the very end. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, issued messages to the last remaining fighters in Mariupol that a surrender was authorized. Under the intensity of the bombings, the gunfire and artillery shellings and airstrikes that continued to bombard them, they were simply left with no other choice. While plans to surrender were put into motion, humanitarian aid workers attempted to rescue as many Ukrainian civilians from the Azovstal steel plant as they could. 500 refugees were evacuated to safety on the 6th of May, while on the 7th it was announced by the Ukrainian government that all remaining women, children, and elderly people inside the plant had been extracted. Several days passed, and the Russians still maintained their encirclement of the steel plant. Over 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers still remained trapped inside, waiting for further instructions. Serhiy Volinsky, commander of the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, is credited with saying on the 8th of May, quote, "I ask that a higher power find a way to figure out our rescue. It feels like I've landed in a hellish reality show in which us soldiers fight for our lives, and the whole world watches this interesting episode. Pain, suffering, hunger, misery, tears, fears, death. It's all real." Russian military representatives accepted the surrender of those trapped at the Azovstal steel plant on the 9th of May. Up until the 12th, Russia persisted with their offensive, and the Ukrainian soldiers remained trapped inside the plant. By the 16th, the defenders could take no more, and 9 representatives were chosen to exit the plant, facing the Russian guns with only a white flag. The surrender was officially put into practice, and soon wounded soldiers were taken from Azovstal to the Donetsk People's Republic-controlled town of Novoazovsk, where they were finally given medical attention. Many of these soldiers would soon be classified as prisoners of war, and Zelensky assured his people in an address that everything would be done to bring them home. But despite all of this, not all of the Ukrainians at Azovstal agreed to surrender there and then. While several hundred injured or surrendering Ukrainian soldiers had been removed from the plant, hundreds more chose to stay, prompting a response from Vladimir Putin. Putin issued a statement informing the remaining fighters that anybody who chose to surrender now would be treated, quote, in accordance with international standards, when the Russians ultimately took over the city. Still, those trapped inside chose not to surrender. This prompted Russian forces to resume the artillery shelling and airstrikes once more, in a final attempt to encourage the fighters to surrender. Several high-ranking Ukrainian military officers remained within the plant, and finally opted to surrender on the 20th of May, when the shellings and airstrikes became too much to bear. On the 20th of May, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the Azovstal steel plant, and with it the city of Mariupol, was now fully under their control. By the time the city had surrendered, the Russians had taken over 2,000 Ukrainian prisoners of war from Azovstal alone. When the Russians and the Donetsk People's Republic moved in to occupy Mariupol, they began transforming the city from a once thriving hub of culture and commerce to what the Associated Press described as an attempt to, quote, eradicate all vestiges of Ukraine from Mariupol. Forces swept through the city once again, tearing down damaged buildings and evicting any remaining civilians who continued to seek refuge in their fallen hometown. The Azovstal steel plant was demolished by Donetsk forces, and Russia reopened the captured ports by the end of the month. What was left intact of Mariupol started to become as Russian as the victors could make it. Television and radio presenters soon began speaking Russian. Street names were replaced with those used in the era of the Soviet Union, and children were taught in schools using the Russian curriculum. As the Russians surveyed and swept the newly captured Mariupol, they did encounter very small Ukrainian holdouts. What was left of the Ukrainian military in the city attempted a last-ditch effort at defending themselves, but the damage was already done. By the 22nd of May, all of the remaining Ukrainian soldiers in Mariupol were rounded up and taken as prisoners of war by the Russian military. Some of these prisoners will be housed in the Olenivka prison in Donetsk territory, where an explosion, killing 53 and wounding 75, took place in July of 2022. It's unclear just how exactly this explosion was detonated, as both the Ukrainians and the Russians blamed each other. Following the siege of Mariupol, conditions for civilians in the city have been worrying to say the least. The suspected cholera outbreak that arose in April was confirmed by Mayor Boychenko on the 11th of June, and the spread of disease has only worsened by the presence of so many dead bodies who litter the streets. Upon capturing the city, Russia imposed a quarantine to limit the spread of cholera, but concerns from medical officials still note that the disease could begin to spread beyond the reaches of the city if conditions continue not to improve. Boychenko has been vocal in his concerns since the city fell to the Russians, noting that tens of thousands of citizens still living in Mariupol could be at risk of both cholera and dysentery. He also expressed concerns that Russia's officials were not doing enough to save the lives of civilians still living in Mariupol. After the end of the siege, Russian sources claimed that over 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died in Mariupol up to the point that fighting began at the Azovstal steel plant. The Russians also reported that they had taken just under 4,000 prisoners of war in total, and these numbers were also corroborated by Ukrainian officials. While it's true that there has been prisoner exchanges since the fall of Mariupol, many still remain captured on either side. Ukraine, on the other hand, reported that they had killed 6,500 Russian soldiers during the course of the siege. Over the course of the 4 months, up to 8,000 Russian soldiers had been deployed to Mariupol, while an estimated 14,000 Ukrainians attempted to defend their position. While death tolls for civilians during the siege of Mariupol differ from source to source, Ukrainian reports claim losses of between 22,000 and 87,000, while Human Rights Watch claimed that at least 8,000 civilian casualties were inflicted. Following the Russian occupation, attempts have been made by Ukrainian forces to take back control of Mariupol. In late May, just after the city fell, Ukrainian forces began launching retaliatory missile strikes on Russian positions along Mariupol's outskirts. Ukrainian sources claim that these missile strikes killed over 500 Russian soldiers in the course of the 4 days they were carried out. Missiles also struck the Yalta Health Center, as well as the steel plant that their own men had previously been holed up in throughout the course of the siege. As of 2026, Mariupol is still held by Russian forces, and while attempts have been made to reshape the city following its occupation, much of the destruction caused by the siege remains. Many of Mariupol's residents continue to face dire situations each day. Water and food supply issues persist, and many civilians are holding out in partially destroyed buildings. The future of Mariupol and the people who live there is uncertain, and the siege struck a colossal, perhaps irreversible blow to the city's culture and history. Early 2022 saw many terrible conflicts throughout Ukraine, but it's this siege that may have been the most brutal. Ukraine put up a fierce fight in the face of their invaders, and the Russians used high-pressure tactics in order to wait them out as they did so. In the end, Mariupol soldiers could not withstand the constant barrage of airstrikes, the advancement of Russian troops on the ground, and the fact that they were quickly running out of food and water. It is unknown what will happen to Mariupol in the future, or how the Russo Ukrainian War will ultimately play out. But for now, the city lies firmly in the hands of its invaders. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or a comment down below. All of our content, from the research and scriptwriting to the editing and narration, is completely human-driven, without the use of AI. So if you want to support our channel, consider subscribing, and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next Wars of the World video is released. Thank you for watching.